Okay, so we have CIS-125, and this is going back to 9/21/15 class. We reviewed some items like the basic syntax. We have various resources for syntax for Python that the students can use, and those are accessible through Angel. One of the items we want to talk about today, even though we've mentioned it before, we'll talk about variables. A variable could take a value that it's an integer. Okay, so we talk about numbers that are integers. We could have a variable that would be a floating point, so decimals, or we're storing information as a string. And then I used ASCII code, showing that this represents the capital letter A. So the string is the term might be a little confusing, but we're talking about a string of characters. For example, we might store my name, okay, that would be stored as a string. And we talk about storing items that we don't calculate things on. We just store them so that we can print them out, and there are some manipulation things we can do. The key up here, floating, if you know you're going to need decimal places used in the numbers, integers if you know you're not, in terms of inputting those. Now in Python figures out what you want. So when you have a command, for example, we might, a student wants to use overtime pay rate, and in there they stored 1.5, and they did that initialization. Well, the computer in Python, if you're doing this in Python, it's going to take this value and store it in this memory location. So down here we have memory, and so somewhere in there it's going to store it. And since this is a decimal here, it's going to make this variable a floating point. They'll just figure it out. In software, in a lot of programs, you can declare. Okay, you could declare variables. You could state this variable is going to be of this type. This variable is going to be of this type, which is also a very good way of doing that in your programs. To save some time and effort, Python makes it a little bit easier to learn the syntax of a language if it does some things for you, and that's what Python will try to figure these out for you when you enter the values, either inputting or assigning values using variables. People are still not quite sure, but a lot of times you got to remember a variable in terms of computer and processing. It's just some location there in memory where it's keeping track of the items, and then that information via the bus brought up to the processor, stored in registers, does the work, sends it back to a variable. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit more about that. We take a look here, so we have a problem in which we talk about input, and you think of the variable names that you're going to use. Okay, of these variables, this one probably would be a floating, and then this one and this one, maybe hours and overtime hours, they might be integer variables. You have to be a little bit careful with mixing them within your program. This, the person's name, would be a string. String variable. Okay? Whereas the rest of these would be some type of number. And inside the computer, numbers are stored considerably different than strings. Then we talked a little bit about data, and so your data then would fill those variables. You'd have some form of input, and wherever it gets it from. Right now we're getting it from the console or the keyboard, and while we're running the program, but eventually we can get it from a file. It can be stored in some kind of a list or whatever. But we take our data, whatever that might be, and we store it into whatever the location is. Like there, that might be a name, and the next piece of data here, that might be the wage, and so forth. Once we have that in memory, then we can use it. We can use it to either do some type of calculation and store that in some new variable. Remember, we calculate over here, store over here. Last thing, we already did the tour of Farmer State Bank and Meadowcraft. Here we talk a little bit about functions. There is some predefined code that will do some work for us. We will learn to use this more and more as we go along. The syntax, you'll need to use one of the programming resources to look it up for Python. A couple functions. This would take the integer of whatever number is here. Now most of the time stored there will be a variable that has a value in it. Okay, same thing with the round function. Here we have a variable that has some value stored in it. So you could have a variable here equals, and you're going to round this particular variable, or this whatever value is stored here. And so then the computer, it'll look up this location, bring it up to the processor, round it, and in most cases 0.5 and above would go up, and then it would take what it calculates from here and store it here. And there are all kinds of functions that we can use. We don't spend a lot of time with a lot of them, but once you learn how to use a few, you can learn how to use many other ones. Some have arguments in here, different things to specify different things. The integer, if you think about integer, what it does is it takes whatever number on the number line and takes the next smaller one. So that's different. So if you had something like 4.9 and took the integer of that, that would go back to 4. Whereas if you rounded that, that would go to 5. Alright? So we have these two functions. And so you could use the functions. So for example, if I had some pay equals and did some calculation, and here pay becomes, let's say, 4.321 in memory. So we have the place in memory. Then I could use a function, I'll just say adjusted pay would equal, if I round pay, then it would take that number and round it and store it in adjusted pay. In this case, then it would be 4. Okay? So just as an example. Alright, and that is it for today.